Greetings, tech priests and initiates. My name is Jake, and I am here with Omnissiah Approved. Today I have compiled a list for new players to the game of Warhammer 40k, from worst to best, of the different factions that are playable within this fantastic game. Now, there are well over 30 playable factions in 40k, so I have condensed a few of them for sake of time. We will be doing a list of the 26 armies that I think are where most people are going to look when wanting to get into the game. We're going to analyze their strengths, a little bit about their weaknesses, and why I personally feel that they are or are not good for new players. Keep in mind that this is my opinion, so you're more than welcome to disagree. As a matter of fact, if you do disagree, let me know in the comment section below. Be a good little form of conversation. But without further ado, let's get started with number 26 on the list, Sisters of Silence. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Sisters of Silence, there's really not much to talk about here. The line of models is really restrictive, just consisting of a couple different options on how to build the same kit. One with bolt guns, one with flamers, one with rather impressive two-handed swords. The only HQ choice they have is a Forge World option. Or you can pick up the new dual kit that came out with a Sister of Silence character and an ADEPTUS Custodian character. But you have to run them together, and they actually, rules as written, don't function in a match play environment. Unfortunately, the Sisters of Silence just don't really have a home, and honestly, they're more of a dishonorable mention than an actual spot on the list. They are really cool, and there are rumors saying that they are going to get rolled into the Adeptus Custodes Codex on the next go-round. If that happens, you may actually see them on the board because their rules aren't terrible. They can shut down psychic powers relatively efficiently, and there are no slouches in combat, in spite of only being basic human stat lines. So, here's hoping they get a better cut in later editions. Coming in at number 25, we have Chaos Demons. The Neverborn are a really unique army. They consist of 4 different chaos gods and the demons that serve them. And they have a really wide range of miniatures with different aesthetics to each of them. Khorne being the red, bloodthirsty demons that you would think of from Christian mythology. Nurgle's demons being bloated and pustuled creatures of disease and rot. All the way up to Tzeentch and the bird-like demons that tend to wander through its domain. All of them are very unique, and all of them work really distinctly from one another. But there's the problem. It's really difficult to make one army out of Chaos Demons. You make a full army of Khorne demons. Yes, it does work and has rules to support them, but it's missing something. It's a really melee-heavy army without a good way to get his units into melee. Tzeentch demons are really psychically powerful, but they lack the versatility to be able to survive a lot of shooting and combat, so they kind of fall short anywhere outside of the psychic phase. The only one that's even remotely playable by itself and able to put up a fight against what you'll be playing against are Nurgle demons, and even they work best when you take them with Chaos Space Marines. And being as we're looking at these by themselves, not combined with other things, I'm gonna have to say that they're not really the best place to start, and that pains me a little because one of my first armies was Chaos Demons, and I loved them. But that was a different time. Summoning was different, and to be quite honest, right now, pure demons, they don't really seem to cut it. At number 24, the Adeptus Custodes. Here we have the Emperor's Golden Boys, his personal bodyguard. Now, these miniatures are really impressive, and they pack a punch on the battlefield, especially the jet bikes and more mobile units. They hit like a truck and are mobile enough to get in and out of combat without getting hurt. It's really impressive. But there are a couple problems with the line from a new player perspective. They're a very elite army. What I mean by that is, they'll have a very small model count when you put them on the table. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it just means you're going to have to be more intelligent about how you commit your forces. With a low model count army, if you accidentally lose one unit, well, yeah, it's pretty terrible if that unit was a good quarter of your army. With the ADEPTUS Custodes, there's also a problem with availability. Now, a good chunk of models that they have access to are Forge World models. Being made out of resin, they tend to be a little bit more difficult for new people to work their way around. They're also going to be a bit more expensive. On top of that, though they are mostly gold, they can be a bit intimidating to paint for someone who's not really done it before. There's a lot of highlights and a lot of shadows to keep in mind, and sometimes you'll end up spreading paint to areas you don't intend to, and that can be annoying for people to fix when they don't know how. I think the biggest crux of it is that it's an army that punishes you for playing incorrectly, but the reward for playing correctly isn't much better than the punishment in most cases. Custodes are really, really cool, and I do encourage you to look at adding them to your collection later on, but it's not where I would start. Number 23. The Grey Knights. Grey Knights are another elite army, much like Adeptus Custodes. They differ, however, in combat doctrine and strategies. The Grey Knights are a psychic-centered army. In fact, every unit that they have, except for their vehicles, are psychers and can cast some form of psychic power. They are relatively easy to build and paint. Their kits are a bit older, which has its benefits, making them a little bit simpler to put together, and they're relatively easy to paint. Though they are full metallic, they lack a lot of the excess filigree and embellishments that the Custodes have. As well, they're relatively cheap when you're looking at buying a battalion. About $150 can get you your 3 troop choices and 2 HQs. That's a lot of bang for your buck, and there can be a significant reason to look at dipping your toes into them. However, because they are a psychic-centered army, and the majority of their strength comes from those psychic powers, being able to understand them and keep track of them is paramount. Having your characters use the appropriate psychic powers to buff and debuff both your units and your enemies' units will make the difference between winning a game handily or having your models shot off the board. The Grey Knights are mostly what people are calling mini-marines, lacking any primaris whatsoever. All of the marine models are going to be single wound unless they're Terminators. Now, they do have a lot of Terminators, which are amazingly fun and powerful, but that can become a bit expensive to get those models and kit them out the way you would want them. Grey Knights are a fantastic army. As a matter of fact, they're the army that I am personally playing at a competitive level, and I love them. But I think they make a better second army after you've gotten a better grasp of how to harness the nuance of the psychic phase, the technical side of the movement phase. They make a great second army, not a good first one. Number 22, the Thousand Suns. The Sons of Magnus come in at 22 for around the same reason Grey Knights were 23. They're another psychically focused army. The majority of their punch power comes from the amount of sheer damage they can throw out during the psychic phase. But having to worry about mastering a phase that can be very complex and time-consuming when you're first getting into the game is a little bit difficult. The reason that they edge out the Grey Knights, however, is because they have a much wider selection of models and units, partially being that they have access to Chaos Demons of Tzeentch as part of their main codex. This gives you a few options on your troops choices, so you're not stuck with the Rubric Marines, and you can go into things like Zangors, Pink Horrors, all that good stuff. On top of all that, the models tend to be a little bit difficult to put together and paint. That can be a bit of a pain for people who are not quite sure how to navigate that yet. Granted, all Chaos models tend to have this problem, but it's not as extreme for most of them as it is on the Thousand Suns. Granted, the models are absolutely beautiful, and they have a really, really fun playstyle, being a very aggressive psychic army that's not as reliant on using psychic buffs and debuffs, and is more about just using the mental prowess of their warriors to strike out and destroy whatever gets close. It's a really, really fun army once you get the hang of it, but for the same reasons as the Grey Knights, I don't really recommend them as a first army. Take a look at them after you've gotten the basics down. Number 21, the YNNARI. The YNNARI are a tough one, to be honest. They don't really have much by way of unique models. They only have 3. And while these models are fantastic to paint, and they're gorgeous on the tabletop with some really interesting rules and interactions. The army itself suffers from kind of a mixed identity, and that's by design. The YNNARI itself is made up of all the ELDAR factions. So you have the CRAFTWORLD, Dark ELDAR, and the Harlequin ELDAR. You can pull from any of these factions to make your army, which is really, really cool and can create for some very interesting army compositions and interactions. But once again, that can be a bit of a problem for someone who's just getting into it. You have a lot more variables to think about when building your army for the first time, and having to juggle all these different rules and keywords and the things that make all three of the ELDAR factions unique and try to combine them into something that'll work well can be really hard for people who've played the game for a long time. And YNNARI went through a time where they were the scariest thing around, and they've been beaten pretty hard with the nerf bat. So, you know, once you do have a good army composition, it's very likely that it still won't be able to stand up, especially against the Marine heavy meta that you end up seeing. I mean, Marines are going to be the most common thing you play for a number of reasons, and that's something you do have to keep in mind, is how they'll match up against them. And as much as YNNARI are really cool, I mean, they're space elves that worship a god of death. Like, that's pretty amazing. They just don't really translate on the tabletop anymore. And that's partially because in past editions, they were way too powerful. So they had to do something to adjust them. And I think they may have taken them a little too far at this point, but that's another conversation in itself. If you want to do Eldar, pick one of the other ones, any of the other ones, and just learn it really well. After you get it down, then you can pivot into YNNARI if you want to be able to mix and match some of your favorite units from each faction. Now we are going to cover numbers 19 and 20 together. The main reason for that is for sake of time, but it's also because they're almost interchangeable. That would be Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights. Both of these armies have very similar functions within the game, with a few tweaks here and there for flavor. Chaos Knights are extra spiky and have a really, really cool aesthetic to them, leading to the machines themselves looking like they've been possessed by demons. As a matter of fact, that's something similar to what you can do with them rules-wise. Imperial Knights, on the other hand, are a little bit cleaner of aesthetic and tend to be relatively uniform in design, where Chaos Knights have a bit more variety in how they're shaped and how their armor looks. The thing about them from a new player perspective comes down to cost. If you buy them straight from GW, you're looking at between $160 to almost $200 for a kit, depending on which kit you're going to get. Now, the only reason that Imperial Knights edge out Chaos Knights in this is because you can find more Imperial Knights, and I stress that this is Imperial Knights. They do not have the Chaos iconography to them, although with some clever painting and customization, you can make them Chaos Knights. But you can find these kits on sites like eBay for relatively cheap, as long as you're not too finicky about getting the extra bits and give up a little bit of control on how they're equipped. So, for that reason, Imperial Knights barely edge out Chaos Knights in new player friendliness, but neither army is really that new player friendly. They're really tough, and they're really, really hard to destroy on the board, especially at low points levels. So, one side effect of this is if you and a couple friends are getting into the game and your army consists of one Imperial Knight, yeah, that is a perfectly valid army choice. But it's not going to be a super fun game for your opponent either. Unless you're planning on going up to 2,000 points and running several knights with armorers and bringing in some allies to fill it out, it's not really going to balance out until you get to that point cost. Knights are very overpowered at low points, and at high points they're surprisingly tricky to play right, at least in the Chaos Knight variant. Another thing against the Chaos Knights is they almost have to have allies of some sort to be able to do anything whenever you do get to higher points costs and you do get to more competitive games, if that is your goal, of course. Whereas Imperial Knights are more than happy to just be a solo knight army and just benefit from helping each other and just the natural benefits you get from being a part of a knightly house. They're super, super cool armies, and if you do not have an Imperial Knight in your collection after you've played for a while, God, go out and buy one. They're a bit of a chore to put together, but they're an absolute delight once you have them built, and there's nothing quite like setting down a large stompy robot on the battlefield. It's kind of why I got into the game, to be honest. Now we come to number 18 on the list, Genestealer Cult. Genestealer Cult is basically like learning the game on hard mode, if you're into that sort of thing. So as a new player coming into it, just be aware that if you choose Genestealer Cult, you're going to have to learn a few alternate rules here. Genestealer Cult's primary gimmick has to do with how they deploy and how they deep strike onto the field. It's really flavorful and plays to the fantasy of the army very well, but like I said, you're basically playing an army that breaks the rules of the game, potentially before you fully understand the rules of the game. Now, this can have the result of making you a very, very good player after a lot of trial and error, but some people can get disheartened if they're trying to figure out their army and just continue to struggle in games because they're having trouble understanding the ins and outs of how they're supposed to work. They can be very rewarding to build since their models look very interesting as these hybrids between human and alien, and you also gain access to ASTRA MILITARUM units, so tanks, a lot of foot soldiers, and Tyranid units, so your giant monstrous creatures. You can field an army that has these flying aliens that shoot venom from guns that are grafted onto their arms, tank columns firing barrages at the enemy, and then legions of foot soldiers that are backed by other aliens that can run across the field lightning quick and rip things apart with their bare claws. It's really cool. I mean, it's really, really evocative of this, like, hectic battlefield, but, you know, for me, I always recommend that people spend some time with an army that allows them to really get a grasp on the core rules of the game before they start breaking those rules. That's just my suggestion. But in all honesty, for being this low on the list, they're a really nice army to start collecting just from a pure options standpoint. Because all the options you're dipping into are pretty valid on their own as well. At number 17, we have the Tyranids. That's right, the Tyranids, with enough gaping maws and tentacles to make H.P. Lovecraft giddy with anticipation. This army has the most unique aesthetic and design of any other army within 40k. They're quite literally Lovecraftian horrors smashed together with the aliens from the movie Aliens. They have a really, really vast array of color schemes and designs and lore to go by, and they're quite possibly, within the setting, one of the largest threats to all life within the galaxy. The main thing for new players that I do caution is what can happen, and what I've seen happen is new players will get into Tyranids, will see how many small units they need, how many troops choices they need, and will buy in wholesale. I mean, your troops choices are not very expensive per box, and you can stock up on a lot of Hormagaunts and a lot of Termagants really, really quickly. But a lot of the times people do that and get very overwhelmed. So the Tyranid spot on this list is to be taken with a grain of salt. They're not super difficult to learn, nor are they really, really hard to collect, but the fact that you need so many of them and the time investment that goes into getting them built and painted is not to be underestimated. I don't know, maybe I'm a little sentimental because I do love Tyranids. They're probably my favorite army to play against, which is a weird thing to say, I guess, but just if you're planning on trying to get into Tyranids, just kind of know what you're getting into ahead of time. You don't want to be stuck with an ocean of gray plastic and not know what to do with it after all. If the Imperium of Man had a Black Ops organization strictly for Space Marines, it's the DEATHWATCH. The entirety of the DEATHWATCH is made up of different Space Marines from different chapters being brought in to work in combined units. What that translates to for the tabletop is you basically can equip each individual Marine within your unit a different way. Now, even more so than the normal, I'm going to give the Sergeant a chainsword, and then this guy will have a special weapon. You can give your regular baseline Marine a Storm Shield and a Power Fist if you want to, or you could go Stormbolter and Lightning Claw. crazy combination of things. Now, by far the most competitive for your baseline Marines is going to be a Storm Shield and a Storm Bolter. But you can also even go as putting a Marine on a bike in the unit, give a guy a jump pack. Like, you can do some crazy things with it. So it's really cool. The rules are pretty solid, especially if you're playing against someone who's running some of the alien races, because that's what the DEATHWATCH are made to do. They're made to hunt down and kill aliens. The main reason that I don't recommend them is not really anything to do with their playstyle or anything to do with the aesthetic of the models or difficulty in painting. The problem comes when you decide you want to build your army a certain way. Say you want to equip 4 Marines out of a 10-man unit with Storm Bolters and Storm Shields. Well, guess what? A 10-man box does not come with enough Storm Bolters and Storm Shields to do that. What ends up happening is, if you want to build not even a tailored or optimized list, but just you want to go hard on a theme, then you have to buy either multiple kits to build up into just 1 or 2 units, or you have to go to a third-party bit seller. So there's a lot of extra legwork you have to do with it, and that's not necessarily a great way to get into it, because you're having to do extra legwork and buy more things, and it can become expensive both in time investment and monetary investment. But if you really like the aesthetic of them, they play just fine, and they've got some really neat tricks that are relatively easy to understand. They don't break the rules in any way, other than the unit composition. So, you know, it's hard to recommend them just because of the difficulty to actually make a unit the way that you really want to. But, you know, there are definitely worse armies out there, and they do have a really cool aesthetic. Coming in at number 15, the Harlequins. The killer clowns from outer space come in with a pretty interesting look about them when compared to the rest of the armies in 40k. Some very bright colors and super detailed patterns can make for a really amazing looking army, but they do pose some problems for people just getting into it. Some people may be very intimidated by the small size and stature of the models. You know, very difficult to paint areas, especially if you want to build up some of those intricate patterns, as well as the army is rather restrictive in what it allows you to take. Just 1 troop's choice, a couple characters, 1 bike's choice, and a couple vehicles. That's it. It can really push you down a playstyle that, if you love their playstyle, you'll absolutely adore them and never want to do anything else. But when you're just learning, it can be kind of a mistake to take an army that can be so restrictive and can push you so hard down a certain path. If you're interested in Eldar, I do recommend going at one of the other 2 options first before you try Harlequins. Harlequins make a great addition to an Eldar army, even just to be able to splash in. But speaking of the other Eldar, at number 14, the DRUKHARI. The DRUKHARI are a group of dark elves, basically. They're hedonistic and homicidal, to say the least. The army itself plays on the tabletop with a bunch of very fast units that can be very hard-hitting, but is a bit of a glass cannon. They're just as likely to get shot off the board if they don't destroy your opponent or seriously damage them in the first turn or 2. They also suffer from an issue of kind of sub-factions inside of sub-factions. Some of your units will fall into the Cabals, and some will fall into the Homunculus Coven. Now, special rules for these don't really overlap, which means you'll usually want to pick one or the other, which can be kind of confusing when you're just starting out. You know, why can't I use this really cool Talos paint engine and use this rule with it? It doesn't work because it's not Covens. I don't know. Dark Eldar is an army that have a really edgy aesthetic, and if that's your thing, more power to you, and by all means, get into them. They're not terribly difficult to build or paint, and they do have a really cool aesthetic to them if that's the type of thing you're looking for. But there are better options when looking at getting into the game as far as ease of access and ease of play. Number 13, CRAFTWORLD Eldar. The CRAFTWORLD Eldar are probably going to be the most universally appealing to people getting into the 40k, as far as the Eldar factions go at least. They have consistently been one of the most popular and most powerful armies in the game, having a lot of variety in how you can play them. Their units themselves have a lot of variety in color and customization, allowing you to try different paint schemes and techniques for your different troops choices. On top of that, this army has probably the largest room to grow as you learn. As you get better with the psychic phase, you look at being able to incorporate more complex lists and like seer councils and things that live and die by the psychic phase. If you're more into the vehicle side of things, you can go with Eldar flyers. I mean, honestly, CRAFTWORLD Eldar is probably the first army on this list that I really can wholeheartedly recommend to a new player. And with that in mind, all of the selections moving forward are all armies that I am pretty confident to recommend to new players. We're going to be spending a little more time on what makes each army different from one another and a little less time on the negative light of it. I don't want this video to turn into a rant, but anyway, let's move forward with number 12. At number 12, the Tau Empire. The Tau are probably the best strictly shooting army in the game. Almost every single unit in their army is dedicated to the singular purpose of maximizing the efficiency of their ranged weaponry. So as a new player, if that's the playstyle you're looking for, this is where you need to start. Other armies are good at shooting, but the Tau, they wrote the book on shooting. On top of that, the range of models are undeniably clean and sleek looking. They have a very defined aesthetic to them that is very visually pleasing, with a lot of straight angles, but not in the way that you would think. Like some other factions have rather boxy appearances with large, bulky armor plates. With the Tau, even their large mechs tend to be rather sleek and have strange angles to them that are very appealing to the eye. The only issue with playing the Tau that I can think of doesn't actually have anything to do with the army itself. See, within Warhammer 40k's fanbase, for some reason, the Tau have a reputation for being terrible. Not terrible on the tabletop, but terrible to play against. Whether the actual rules support that assertion or not, it's something that's there and you should be aware of it. If you go to a shop and say, hey, I'm interested in playing Tau, somebody somewhere will make a comment about it. I'm not really sure why this is. The closest thing I can think of is because the Tau are the closest thing to a good guy that the setting has. Or maybe it's because, to lore, they look down on other races that use hand-to-hand combat as being more primitive and less civilized as them. I don't know. It's just something to be aware of. Number 11. The ADEPTA Sororitas. The Sisters of Battle, though long ignored, have now been given the attention that they so truly deserve. A brand new codex full of special rules and abilities, a complete revamp to their line of models, taking them from the old pewter models that were very, very old and out of date when compared to the rest of the game to brand new, beautiful miniatures. Something that is very important when looking at these from an aesthetic point of view is they are the only all-female faction in the game, providing a much-needed difference to the big spaceman and big space armor. On top of that, the Sisters of Battle have some really unique rules to them, giving them things like miracle dice, which allow them to literally pick what a dice roll turns up to be, based off of variables that have happened throughout the game. Sisters are very rewarding to play, giving you some much-needed benefits to playing them correctly, while not punishing you too hard for playing them incorrectly. With that being said, they can be really fun to get into, and are not too difficult to learn in their current incarnation. There are some downsides, like the miracle dice can be a little confusing when you first get into it, and being a brand new line of models, they are not on the cheap side. Their average troop box is going to be around $60. But, with that being said, they are a phenomenal army to play. They look stunning on the tabletop, and they have a layer of consistency throughout all of their units because they're a brand new army that most armies can't really boast. Hell, even the Space Marines, some of their old units are 8, 9 years old at this point, and if you go into Eldar, they're still using old pewter models. It took a long time, but the sisters are finally getting the respect they deserve, and if that's something that appeals to you, by all means, go get some. Coming in at number 10, we have the Necrons. Necrons are another army that kind of steps away from the traditional aesthetic of the 41st millennium, looking more like T-800s with an ancient Egypt fetish. The units in the army are pretty diverse, having units that can handle close combat very, very well, such as your Wraiths that can phase through terrain and models and just rip things apart while having a 3+ invulnerable save. They're dead hard and really, really difficult to shift for your opponent. And other than the Wraiths, you have things like Immortals that can take Tesla carbines, which give you free additional hits whenever you roll 6s. Free additional hits. That's amazing. Anything that can increase the odds of doing damage is going to help you, and sometimes in a game, all you need to do is throw enough dice at something and it will die eventually. Another big plus to the army is the fact that they're obscenely easy to paint. They're basically able to be done well with a rattle can of a metallic that you like and then a dip wash. Their sculpts lend themselves with very defined creases and low spots for the washes to settle, which creates a nice bit of contrast from the high metallic. Run a few green spots on it, put in your little plastic rods they give you, and ta-da! The army's done. Well, at least good enough to play with for the first time. It's not uncommon for someone to paint up a full Necron force in a couple days using relatively minimal effort, and that's a good thing when you're just starting. Nothing beats the satisfaction of having a fully painted army when your friends are just barely out of gray plastic. It's pretty satisfying, honestly, and can be a really big emotional boon for a new player. Necrons are a really well-rounded army with some decent rules that are only looking to get better when they finally get touched up by Psychic Awakening. It's something that I really do recommend if you want to go something a little bit off the reservation as far as the way the army looks. And another benefit to it is they don't have psychic powers, so that's another thing you don't have to worry about. But if you want something that's psychic-like, you can add in a couple Catan or shards of the Catan. They have abilities that go off and function similarly to psychic powers, but since they're not psychic powers, they can't be denied. So it also takes a little bit of control out of your opponent's hands. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of the Necrons and how they play for a starting army. They give you a lot of variety, the models look really cool, they're easy to handle. And on top of that, the army can just be really fun to play. Number 9. The Space Wolves. The Sons of Russ have just gotten a shot in the arm with the Saga of the Beast that just came out. With some new rules, they finally are able to feel and compete a little bit better than they did before. A lot of the benefits to this army come from the Viking Space Marine aesthetic. You have warriors literally riding into combat on the back of cybernetically modified giant wolves, or alongside packs of said wolves. This aesthetic will be the selling point or the breaking point for a lot of people. If you're not into the Viking motif, then I've already said enough for you to know that this is not the direction you need to go in. As far as the model range goes, they have some really, really cool models. Like I said, Space Marines on giant wolves. What's not to love about that? The problem can come with, since the invent of the Primaris Marine, they haven't gotten many unique models, but that can also be said for most of the non-standard Space Marine chapters. I think the trouble comes from the fact that the Space Wolves are a assault-centered army that, even after Psychic Awakening, can struggle against other assault-centered armies. But that's not the point here. Space Wolves are really fun to play. Relatively easy, if not a bit time-consuming to paint because of all of their trinkets and furs, but furs are relatively easy to paint and the trinkets are relatively easy. Some unique rules and unique units can come together to make something that is visually pleasing and really, really entertaining for the right person. The only reason I'm not putting them higher up on the list is the fact that, like I said, some people are going to be immediately turned off by the simple look of the model. And if it's not for you, it's not for you. But if you like the idea of having an angry Santa riding a floating chariot pulled by 2 large wolves, this is where you can find that. And that's pretty amazing. Number 8, the Orks. Yet another horde army in the game. They have the same potential challenges as Tyranids when you look at the sheer number of bodies to put on the board. But unlike Tyranids, they have a bit more viable options, and they're significantly easier to paint to the standard you would want. Orcs' appearances are naturally ramshackle and hastily put together and poorly maintained anyway, so that leads for a sloppier paint job to be actually to the aesthetic. As well as your painting skill improves, it allows you to do some really creative things with how that quote-unquote mess and rust and grime is actually portrayed on the model, allowing you to forge a really neat narrative just with the visuals alone. And though they are a horde army at heart, you can take a speed mob full of bikes, vehicles, and other fast things like jets. You can also choose to take a dread mob with a bunch of death dreads, gorkanauts, morkanauts, and even a stompa if you want to go huge with it. Orcs are undeniably just cheerful when they go to combat, and that usually translates to the player, it feels like. There's a reason there's a stereotype about orc players having the most fun with the game compared to everyone else. If you are a true orc player, you will just enjoy crumping the fools who stand in front of you, shedding blood for the pure joy of it. Orcs are really entertaining. The aspect they have in the lore and in the design of their models will either, once again, like the Space Wolves, turn you on or turn you off. But, like I said, they are undeniably fun and a really, really engaging army if you do happen to latch onto the lore and the story behind them. The right amounts of goofy model design combined with just completely brutal and devastating abilities on the tabletop, as well as a brutal aesthetic, can be very, very pleasing and really, really rewarding to collect and play. Look into them if you want to have a little bit of fun. Number 7, Dark Angels. The Dark Angels take the Space Marine formula and refine it down 2 distinct playstyles, first of which being the Deathwing. The Deathwing consists mostly of Terminators. These powerful units can deep strike to pretty much anywhere on the board, delivering very precise blows. Now keep in mind, though these aren't precise, they are hammer blows. Terminators deal out a lot of punishment and can take a decent amount of punishment back. The other, being the Ravenwing, is by far the more competitive choice, utilizing fast units like Ravenwing bikes, jets, land speeders, even utilizing special versions of land speeders that give everything within range cover, and even having a special character in the form of a Talon Master, which is a captain on a land speeder. It can create some really interesting builds, and you can even have fun mix and matching the Deathwing and the Ravenwing together. Their paint styles are relatively easy, and in spite of the fact that the models tend to have a lot of embellishments on them, can be hammered out with not too much difficulty. There is something undeniably cool about the warrior monk aesthetic, because that's something that has been used to describe Space Marines as a whole. The Dark Angels take it at its word and really go into the monastic traditions. Another thing that's really interesting is for their chaplains of their army, they use something called an interrogator chaplain, putting a much darker twist on the grim servants of faith that tend to monitor and stalk through the Space Marine chapters already. Dark Angels allow a lot of flexibility in how you want to build and play them, basically being able to get 2 full armies out of 1 with a little bit of overlap to keep your models reasonable. They are definitely something to consider if you want to go Space Marines, but not just have the same old formula as everyone else. Number 6, the Adeptus Mechanicus. The AdMech come in at number 6 on the list for several reasons, and I do want to stress that they are a good choice for new players. With a model range that is very distinct in and of itself and has a pretty steampunk aesthetic, as the range has been leaning in and out of that aesthetic for quite some time now. New releases coming out later in the year seem to be upping the ante a little bit, giving you things like ornithopters as flyers and jump infantry that have canvas wings that spread out and are rather cool looking in my opinion. ADMEC can be a little tricky for new players to wrap their mind around at first, with rules like the Canticles that allow them to get army-wide buffs at the beginning of the game by rolling a dice and picking a random selection. Otherwise, you can just pick a selection to be in, but you forfeit the ability to go back into that selection for the remainder of the game. This is a good step to teach a new player some problem-solving skills and helping them learn threat assessment. Do I really need to have cover this turn? Well, let's go ahead and take it, but understand you will not be able to take it again. Furthermore, they benefit probably the best of any army in the game by having an Imperial Knight ally, seeing as Knights are actually a part of their codex, not just something you can take as an ally. Having the stratagem Knight of the Cog allows your Knights to benefit from Canticles as well, which it can be absurdly powerful, and I know that from first-hand experience. The ADEPTUS Mechanicus are a great new player army, and on top of that, they're probably one of the better non-Space Marine options for new players. That's very important going forward, as if you're not into Space Marines, this may be one of your better options to get something going that's going to be able to grow with you as you grow in your hobby journey. Learning new painting techniques, getting better at the game, and being able to adapt more complex strategies. The ADMEC can grow with you every step of the way, and that can be very comforting when going into a new army. Number 5. ASTRA Militarum. The Imperial Guard have changed very, very little since their inception, it feels like, focusing on rank after rank of foot soldier and tank and armor columns providing supporting fire. In a galaxy where literal cosmic horrors, alien terminators, and chaos space marines backed by legions of demons, it takes a lot for a single, solitary, ordinary human to stand up and fight. But when you back them behind thousands and thousands of other humans, the true strength of mankind becomes evident. On the tabletop, the Astra Militarum have tried to bring that to light into gameplay. Having ranks of soldiers benefiting from the orders of the superiors, having commissars by their backs to make sure that they are, let's say, persuaded not to flee combat. Giving their lives by the dozen, by the 100, and by the 1,000 for the safety and security of the Imperium. Or maybe just for your win-loss record. The Astra Militarum are probably the best place to go if you love the idea of running heavy armor. They have access to the widest variety of tanks and artillery fires of any other army in the game. Everything from Chimera troop transports, Leman Russ battle tanks, Basilisk heavy artillery, and the very, very impressive Baneblade in all of its variants. If you want to go to war with the sound of cannon fire and tank treads churning up the soil and blood of your enemies, the Astra Militarum is probably the only way to go. Number 4. The Blood Angels. At this point in time, the Blood Angels are the undisputed kings of close combat. With a combination of Death Company, Space Marines who have lost their minds to a patricidically induced psychic madness who fight with the strength of a demigod, backed with the best that the chapter has to offer in the form of the Sanguinary Guard, can make an absolutely devastating hammer and anvil approach to combat. Blood Angels are fast, undeniably so, and they benefit most from being in combat from any other army in the game, it feels like. They can pump out an absurd amount of damage during the fight phase, and they actually have a decent selection of psychic powers that can make them pretty formidable in the psychic phase as well. Blood Angels have a lot to figure out when you get a hold of them, but everything is pretty intuitive. The biggest stress you're going to have to figure out is exactly which character to put beside your blob of Death Company or with your Sanguinary Guard to get the most out of them. It's not super difficult to do, and honestly, it's very rewarding as you do see the pieces coming together, and the results that it can have on the battlefield are absolutely devastating. From a more purely hobby standpoint, the Blood Angels are a pretty simple chapter to paint. Simple rank and file troops being mostly red, gold, and black. Death Company are black with red markings, and though they do have some embellishments on their models, it's nothing that someone can't figure out how to deal with relatively quickly. And then Sanguinary Guard make a really beautiful contrast to the dark and warm colors, with more warm colors in the form of gold, but that extra brightness and shine can make for a really appealing look on the table when you have the army laid out. It's a good place for you to grow your hobby skills, having new things you have to worry about when doing your painting and construction. If you can't tell, I am a huge fan of the Blood Angels. They're probably my favorite Space Marine chapter, which means I want to put them as number 1, but I can't in good conscience do so because there are a few better options out there, but not by much. Number 3, Chaos Space Marines. Chaos Space Marines are, to put it lightly, a customization fever dream for anyone who wants to actually sit and put a little bit of themselves into the models. The entire premise of having a group of Space Marines dedicated to the different gods of chaos is just crying out for customization and for allowing you to make it your own in whatever way you want. And on top of that, Chaos Space Marines are full of different options. You want a melee heavy force, you can make that full of Khorne Berserkers. You want a ranged force, then it's debatable as to which is the best, but I personally like Emperor's Children. They have an ability that as they die, they get to shoot if you take the Noise Marines. There are so many ways that you can take the basic Chaos Space Marine Codex and basic miniature line and turn them into whatever you want. As your playstyle grows and evolves, you can just change the models you're getting for your line. None of the old models you have will be obsolete, as they'll still work well with what you build. And if you want to get really competitive with it, there are many valid Chaos options that take you into the competitive space. Chaos Space Marines epitomize what a new player-friendly army is, in the sense that you will get back what you put into it. If you get into the game, get 1,000 points of models and say, okay, this is good enough for me to play from time to time, you can do that and not feel like you've wasted your time here. But if you dive wholeheartedly into it, you could easily build up 5, 6, heck, even 10,000 points of Chaos Space Marines and never feel like you've wasted your time with them. Every edition can be something special to you. And the same can be said for any army you really get into, but for Chaos it seems to be even more so, at least in my opinion. Chaos Space Marines have really simple yet powerful rules for anyone to understand. If you want to learn the Psychic phase, you have access to different types of Psychers. If you want to include Demons, Knights, whatever you want to do, you can include those things into your army. They're very new player friendly, if for no other reason than the sheer glut of options that you have. And unlike some of the other armies that suffer from having too many options for new players, everything within Chaos seems to fit. Your options become, do I want to take a squad of Chaos Marines, or do I want to take a squad of Khorne Berserkers? If I want to get into melee, Berserkers are better than basic Chaos Marines, but if I want to be shooty, Chaos Marines are better. Ta-da, that's as complex as the question gets. It leads to a bit more ease of creation when it comes to making your first army. And like I said, the sheer amount of options, not just in rules, but just the sheer size of the range, is very beneficial. And being one of the primary factions in 40k, you know that they will get at least some love when it comes to new models and releases. Chaos is and will always be a fantastic choice for anyone starting out. Number 2, the Death Guard. Keeping with the Chaos Marine theme, the Death Guard come in as one of the most easily accessible armies in the game. For multiple reasons, the army is relatively easy to paint in spite of the complexity of their sculpts. They're ultra resilient on the tabletop. I mean, their entire gimmick is that they could take a lot of punishment and just keep coming at you. Death Guard take advantage of rules that make them super hard to kill, and Plague Marines can take some absolutely punishing weapons. When supported by things like Plague Burst Crawlers and Blight Drones, they can just march up the board tearing into anything with very little worry of being retaliated against. Add in Nurgle Demon Princes, which are very powerful and can add in some nice psychic support, and the big man himself, Mortarion, if you want to go that direction. And speaking of Mortarion, the Death Guard have some of the most creative and honestly interesting character models in the game. And that goes beyond just their appearance. They have amazing rules as well, being able to buff up an army to make them nigh unstoppable. And to top it all off, when you're looking at this from the standpoint of a player wanting to get into the game, Death Guard are everywhere. And by that I mean they were part of the original box for 8th edition, and you can find that half of the box very, very cheaply on secondary markets, eBay being a good example. They've also been part of the line of the easy-to-build models, meaning that you can find very good deals on models. For example, being able to find easy-to-build Death Guard Terminators cuts the price down relatively severely. Normally a $60 box can be acquired for $30. If you go online, you can find it even cheaper. Death Guard are really, really powerful. Really, really pleasing to play if you're into their playstyle, which is very resilient Marines that can operate as fire bases. For an army that is part of the Ruinous Powers, can be expanded to add in different types of Chaos Marines, Chaos Knights, Chaos Demons down the road, Death Guard are probably going to be the most easily accessible army in the game for you. And for that reason, I have to put them this highly up on the list. They're simply fantastic for new players. Number 1. The ADEPTUS Astartes. Space Marines are in the best position they've been in for the past few editions. The range has been elevated to a status that can't really be said for any other army in the game. Their rules are consistently powerful. Models get updated consistently quickly, and it doesn't seem like you can go a month without seeing new Space Marines on the horizon. The new Primaris Marine line is genuinely fantastic, with very high quality models that are pretty easy to build and relatively easy to paint when compared to some of the more complex kits that you can find in other armies. And on top of all of that, Space Marines have a lot of different playstyles that they can support. Literally every single type of army in the game can be played, except for Horde, I guess, but who really wants to do Horde Space Marines? If you're looking for an army that can support aggressive play, White Scars can probably do it for you. You like bolt guns and want to just load up on those and sit back and shoot things? Imperial Fists are probably what you need to look into. If you want to never have friends again, play Iron Hands. Just a few things to kind of mention about this though is, it may be a little bit unfair with the current state of things. The Vanilla Space Marine Codex by itself is really good, and you have ways to build your own chapter, and you can make some really fun and creative combinations just out of that. When you combine the supplements, it really becomes difficult for any other army to compete with them when it comes to the first army you should look into. I mean, Space Marines are the flagship army of the game for a reason. Games Workshop wants to make them good, wants to make them accessible. And on the note of accessibility, just like the Death Guard, Space Marines were the other half of the 8th edition starter box, which means you can find your intercessors, your basic Primaris troop choice, you can find them for pretty cheap on eBay for 10 of them. Same thing with Hellblasters and the Inceptors that come in with it. Space Marines are the core of what 40k is, and for that reason alone, you should consider getting into them as an army. But for all the other reasons I've mentioned, they are the best army to consider for new players. And there we have it. This has been a compilation of my opinions of the different factions in Warhammer 40k from the standpoint of starting the game as a new player. As previously stated, you are more than welcome to disagree with these opinions, and I do encourage you to share your opinions in the comment section below. But for now, I would like to personally thank all of you who have listened this far, if indeed you are listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again. And as always, this video has been Omnissiah Approved.